Welcome to the History of North America. I'm Mark Vinet. England and the Netherlands fought 3 maritime wars on grounds of commercial and naval rivalry. The Third Anglo-Dutch War put the British colony of New York at risk in 1673. Let's travel back with Eric Yanis of the Other States of America podcast to learn more about this remarkable time in North American history.
On July 28, 1673, the Dutch fleet took sight of New York Bay, and they came to anchor off of Sandy Hook. Just New York City itself had about 2,500 residents. Most of them were still Dutch. The next day, the Dutch sent a letter to the Dutch of New York City and those other residents who had lived there when it was New Amsterdam. Part of it said the following:
"We do not intend to bring harm to anyone who voluntarily submits to the aforementioned high mightiness, under whom before this you live so peacefully."
In other words, if you submit to the States General of the Netherlands and the Prince of Orange, life can go on just as it did before under the English, and before that under the Dutch. And in the nicest way possible, this was the Dutch telling the people of New York City, "We're coming." They also sent messages to the commander of Fort James, who was a certain Captain Manning, informing him that 600 Dutch Marines were prepared to lay siege to the fort if necessary. In the back and forth messages between the English fort and the Dutch fleet, Captain Manning tried his best to stall the Dutch from doing anything. Every deadline that the Dutch would give him, he would respond at the very end of it. In their correspondence, Captain Manning would give non-committal answers, vague responses, or answer questions with questions. Of course, the Dutch were on him, and they surmised that Captain Manning was surely stalling, in the hope that reinforcements would arrive from Connecticut, or perhaps New Jersey, or maybe the fort in Albany. The truth of the matter is Fort James had about 100 defenders. Once the Dutch got sick of Captain Manning, their pen pal, forestalling what they saw as the inevitable, they decided to land the Marines under the command of Captain Colve, while at the same time they started exchanging fire with the fort itself from their warships. After about an hour of this back and forth, the English fort had just about had it. The guns that they had there, the cannons, they were in disrepair, and a few didn't even work at all. One Englishman in the fort actually decided to do a little showboating, parading around the English flag at the top of the fort, promptly had his head shot off. Captain Manning on the shore with his Marines began marching down Broadway. Much to their delight, the people of New York City came out to cheer on the parade of men heading to Fort James. Somehow these raiders and soldiers of opportunity became liberators, at least in the eyes of the Dutch living in New York City. Cole stopped some distance from Fort James, well beyond cannon shot, and waited. Captain Manning in the fort, seeing that he was outgunned at sea and outmanned on land, threw up the white flag for a truce. Captain Colve, seeing the flag, made his final advance upon Fort James. Captain Manning from within the fort drafted terms of surrender and sent them out to Captain Colve. Manning asked that all of his men be allowed to leave unmolested from the fort with their possessions. But Captain Colve, he sensed weakness in the man and sent Captain Manning back his own terms, which stipulated that Manning was to surrender along with his men, they were to be disarmed, and then become prisoners in their own fort. Surprisingly, Captain Manning agreed, and he threw open the gates to Fort James. Admirals Evertson, Banks, and Colve seized all of the property within the fort in the name of the Netherlands for losses that they received during the first takeover of New Netherland. The next day, the prisoners were sent onto the Dutch ships, where they could be more easily secured, they could be stopped from escaping, and have no influence on the population around them. A number of the Dutch Marines decided to ransack nearby estates, including the house of Governor Lovelace, still not in the colony, and the mayor of New York City, John Lawrence. Feeling that this would threaten the peaceful takeover of New York City, the Dutch captains did execute at least one of their men for looting. On July 31st, 1673, the Dutch renamed New York City New Orange, and Fort James, Fort Willem Hendrik, both of course in honor of the Prince of Orange. And with that, New Netherland was reborn. But it was tiny. We're talking about Manhattan Island. And outside of that, at least in theory, there still remained a New York and a New Jersey. Evertsen and Banks, along with Colve, of course, had taken the tiger by the tail, and now they had to bring the rest of it to heel. Town by town, village by village, the men created what they called a council of war that would serve as a provisional government working out of Fort James. Colve, again the man in charge of the Marines, was selected to be the governor of New Netherland. A wise choice. Again, he seemed to have had some connection to the Prince of Orange, and he was the highest ranking officer outside of Admirals Evertsen and Banks over the land forces, which will become important if you want to maintain a colony. Not surprisingly, deputies from towns in New Jersey, not all the towns in New Jersey, but many of the towns, especially the Dutch towns, began arriving in New Orange as early as the 2nd of August to submit to the new Dutch government. This included many of the towns that had been trouble to the Carteret government, and places like Newark was founded by New Englanders from New Haven. Locally, within the city, the Dutch dissolve officially the English government of New York City, and they call for new elections for new officials who will owe their allegiance to the Dutch. They held elections on August 4th. 5 Dutchmen were elected and 1 Englishman. Many of the Dutchmen were the prominent merchants of New Amsterdam in the closing years of the former New Netherland. And so this new Netherland wasn't so much a revolution or even seen as a next phase. Rather, it was reverting back to the former status quo. And a very important part of that status quo was maintaining trade and a good relationship with the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. Luckily for the Dutch, a cabal of Dutch traders, even under English rule, controlled the communication lines between the Iroquois and the English authorities at what they call the city of Albany. Now all Governor Colve had to do was send some men upriver, up the Hudson River, and bring Albany back into the New Netherland fold. And along the way, garner the allegiance of any settlement that might be along the Hudson River. This would include the very early settlement of Kingston, whom the Dutch called originally Wildschwik, meaning wild town. A force of 70 men and 2 ships is placed under the command of a man named Lieutenant Becker, and they set out in early August of 1673 to secure what we would now call upstate New York. When he arrives in Albany, the fort at Albany submitted without a struggle, and Lieutenant Becker renamed it Fort Nassau. And the city of Albany became Willemstad. Again, both names an homage to the Prince of Orange. Without any struggle, he had all the towns along the Hudson submit to Dutch authority. He even had the lonely town of Schenectady on the Mohawk River, mostly full of Dutch anyway, submit to this new authority. These towns quickly held their own elections for their own deputies who would serve as representatives to the governor. Before the end of the month, those deputies found their way down to New Orange to receive the blessing of Governor Colve himself. Now let's head out to Long Island. The Dutch settlements on Long Island very quickly submitted to the new Dutch government at New Orange. No surprise there. But then further east on the island, eastern Long Island would prove to be a challenge. Those English towns, those troublesome English towns who were settled by New Englanders who didn't actually want to be part of the New Haven colony or the Connecticut colony, and who had spent the last 10 years balking at the idea of being part of the New York colony, they did not volunteer to join this new colony of New Netherland. Yes, these towns full of Englishmen, they didn't even want to be part of an outside English authority, let alone a new and shaky Dutch government established by sailors. Nevertheless, a few towns submitted to the new Dutch authority, although most of them simply did not respond, which really was the wisest course to take in this particular situation if you were English. If this new Netherland proved to be short-lived and English authority was reestablished, you could not be punished for being a turncoat. At the same time, by not responding, if the Dutch decided to show up in force, well, you haven't outright rejected their authority. So, if push came to shove, you could submit at that later time, if it ever even came. It seems like some English towns were playing the waiting game. As their recent history had demonstrated, this is the Third Anglo-Dutch War, and so patterns begin to develop. and they know that Anglo-Dutch wars tend to not last very long. And probably within a year or so, they wouldn't have to submit to some guy in a fort on Manhattan Island. The respective mother countries of the Netherlands and of England would make a peace treaty. There might be some trades back and forth, and they will let you know under whose empire you belong. So maybe just wait it out, so you don't end up giving your allegiance over to the loser. But, again, the parts of old New Netherland, as it was in 1664, very conveniently fell into place. We have most of what you would now call New York State, except again for that little part of Long Island. All the settlements around Manhattan Island very quickly sent their deputies to Fort William Henry. And then the settlements in what would now be New Jersey and even Delaware, as they had become accustomed to doing, completely ignored the Carteret government that was there, and the acting governor, Governor Barry, held new elections and once again became part of New Netherland. Many of the new leaders of the former New Jersey colony, now southern New Netherland, were the same rebel rousers from the last decade who made it nearly impossible for the English to have sensible government in the colony. Now they were the government. Powerless to any of this, acting Governor John Barry and his deputies, they went to New Orange and they sought an audience with Governor Colve and Admirals Evertson and Banks, who initially refused an audience. There's no reason to give this guy any amount of their time. They don't even acknowledge his authority. And when they finally do allow him to have an audience, it was for the purposes of confirming their individual estates under the new Netherland. And with that, New Jersey is subdued. Why was it so easy? Well, the terms for switching your allegiance to the Netherlands, to the Dutch, to the Prince of Orange, were very, very liberal, wherein those who submitted peacefully would get to keep their personal property and their estates and go about their business unmolested, whether they be Dutch or English, German, Swede, or Finn. And for the Englishmen specifically, they were promised that they would not be drafted to fight other Englishmen or an English army. A very appealing offer, especially if you want to continue going about your life as you did before. Also, as became accustomed in the middle colonies anyway, they had a guarantee of freedom of religion, something that the old New Netherland colony had eventually, and something that we will see in East and West New Jersey. Lastly, if you didn't want to submit to the new Dutch authority, you had 6 months to get your affairs in order and leave the colony. Honestly, even that is a fair offer to extend to somebody who has no intention of cooperating with you. And so we've gone from the Mohawk River all the way down to the Delaware River. And for Evertson, Banks, and Colve, in what only took about a month of their time, they had re-established New Netherland.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.